Good afternoon. Welcome to the second BEREC Public debriefing for 23. This is the debriefing on the outcomes of the 55th BEREC plenary meeting that took place last week in Montenegro, hosted by EKIP. We will also use this opportunity of the debriefing to present you BEREC's recent work on 3 items of the so-called connectivity package, which are, as you may already know, the exploratory consultation on the future of the connectivity sector and its infrastructure, the Gigabit recommendation, and the Gigabit Infrastructure Act. Next slide, please. Thank you. A few words about the logistics. Today, the debriefing includes 2 parts. After each part, we will allow time for questions from the audience. We have already received some questions from registered participants that we will try to answer. In addition, all participants are welcome to use the live chat box next to the live streaming window, Slido, during the debriefing to send us questions that we will answer during the Q&A session. So, during the first part, BEREC co-chairs and myself will present the BEREC input to the exploratory consultation of the Commission on the future of connectivity and its infrastructure. Second, our opinion on the draft Gigabit recommendation, and third, our analysis of the draft Gigabit Infrastructure Act. In the second part, we will have presentations about the draft BEREC report on practices and challenges of the phasing out of 2G and 3G networks, which is for public consultation, the BEREC report on interoperability for number-independent interpersonal communication services, the BEREC report on the monitoring of the joint statement between European Union and Ukrainian operators, and some updates on our side. So I will now start with the presentation of BEREC's input to the exploratory consultation of the Commission. As you know, this consultation was launched in February. Deadline was the 19th of May. BEREC input was prepared by coordinated work from almost all working groups, as the questionnaire of the consultation touched upon several issues that required the involvement of many experts, and was prepared on the basis of the collective experience and expertise of all NRAs. Our input includes a 10-page document which followed closely the structure of the questionnaire and answered several questions. The second item was individual answers in the questionnaire when it was considered useful. And we also developed 2 annexes complementing the response to Section 1 and Section 4, which were only published in our website. The main messages already included in the introduction of the 10-page document. BEREC welcomes the consultation and the fact that the Commission is going to share the gathered data, which will allow BEREC to perform further quantitative assessment of the topics under discussion. Second, the document refers to ongoing projects of our work program for 2023 that are related to the topics of consultation. Our main document states that BEREC considers it necessary to constantly collect data in order to monitor the issues under discussion. So this should be an ongoing, continuously exercise. And finally, BEREC will have a role as a dispute resolution body in disputes between content application providers and internet providers, internet service providers. Next slide, please. So our 10-page document is structured in 4 sections, each one corresponding to the sections of the questionnaire. I'll go through the main messages included in each section. The first one focuses on technological and market developments. BEREC highlights that several market and technological trends are blurring and reshaping the traditional boundary between electronic communication networks and electronic communication services and digital services. So we see this convergence. Electronic communication networks and services developments are not only taking place in the last mile segment in the access network. The new technological developments create advantages, but also challenges for the electronic communication networks and services. What are the advantages for electronic communication network services? For example, new, innovative, and differentiated products and use cases, increasing customers' willingness to pay for enhanced connectivity, and many others. Challenges: investments will be required to meet the Digital Decade Policy Program objectives. BEREC's report on the Internet ecosystem and BEREC's report on 5G ecosystem, published recently, identified potential bottlenecks related to the evolving role of big tech companies across the Internet ecosystem. BEREC encourages the adoption of a holistic approach on sustainability. Digitalization is a key enabler of the green transition thanks to its potential contribution to the decarbonization of other sectors of the economy. However, the carbon footprint of the ICT sector itself and digital value chains are responsible for other forms of impacts on the environment. Energy consumption of network operators is too narrow scope the way it is addressed by the questionnaire, omits other elements of ecosystem, especially devices which represent the majority of environmental footprint. Data traffic alone is only one contributor to energy consumption. Deployment of greener infrastructures and of digital services, sustainable by design, would help to achieve environmental targets. The appearance of new technologies and business models have an impact on electronic communications networks architecture and its functions. Apart from opportunities, also regulatory concerns may be raised. BEREC considers that revenues from residential and business electronic communication network services will continue to be an important source of revenue in the electronic communications sector in the coming years. Where there is a recognized lack of demand or business case for very high capacity networks rollout, other measures to deal with this are available. So these were the main points from our section 1 response. Now, next slide, please. Let's move to the second section of the document, focusing on fairness to consumers. BEREC considers that universal service is a safety net which ensures access to an adequate broadband service at an affordable price for all. Universal service offers designed for digital and societal inclusion should not be confused with instruments intended to achieve future connectivity ambitions as defined by the Digital Decade Policy Program goals. To eliminate the digital divide, especially in rural areas, multiple options in European Union, such as the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the RRF funds, cohesion funds, as well as national regulatory tools may be used. A post-COVID study that BEREC conducted indicates different funding mechanisms. Therefore, BEREC considers that public intervention should be clearly regarded as a subsidiary instrument. Contribution to such a fund should be dependent on the defined goals, and its proposed functioning would have to be assessed in detail. Next slide, please. Okay, so coming to section 3 of our response, which is about barriers to single market. BEREC considers that there are no regulatory or technical barriers for providing pan-European services. supranational, very high capacity network deployments are not expected to bring significant cost savings or efficiencies by their scale of operation. Economies of scale can and are reached nationally and even sub-nationally. The general authorization regime operated efficiently without creating barriers for operators to enter national markets. The very nature of the electronic communications market is such that they do not have an obvious cross-border dimension. Consolidation requires careful analysis in all member states, given its potential negative impact on competition. On the second part of this section, radio spectrum is recognized as a scarce natural resource with many competing uses and must be managed effectively and efficiently to maximize benefits to society. Radio spectrum usage naturally propagates beyond national borders, but there is no European Union market for radio spectrum, so allocation and assignment are national functions. BEREC believes that integration can be supported through existing tools. And next slide, please. Coming to this fourth section of our response, that corresponds to the fourth part of the questionnaire. This is related to fair contribution by all digital players. BEREC considers that the entire internet ecosystem should be included when considering policy options. In our preliminary assessment, BEREC considered that there is only a limited relationship between the growth of data traffic volume and the level of investments that must be made to reach a gigabit society. Moreover, the largest cost elements for network deployment relate to the access network. However, BEREC is looking forward to analyzing the data gathered by the European Commission through the consultation, which will allow for further quantitative assessment of our positions on the aforementioned matters. BEREC holds that any regulatory intervention requires a proper justification. BEREC is currently not aware of structural interconnection problems in relation to growing volumes of traffic attributed to content application providers, but BEREC will conduct further analysis in our upcoming report on the IP interconnection market. BEREC has expressed reservations about mandatory financial contribution from content application providers to internet service providers in the form of a sending party network-based regime. Regarding other forms of contribution mechanisms, funding mechanisms, for example, concerns may arise, but any proposed functioning would have to be assessed in detail, and BEREC remains available to contribute to the evaluation of any material proposal that may arise. In its contribution to the exploratory consultation, BEREC examined the effect on competition, end users, and on innovation that the introduction of a sending party network-based regime would have, and expressed its reservations. Concerning the open internet regulation, BEREC notes that any measure proposed should comply with the provisions of open internet regulation. Sustainability cannot be assessed at this stage before the exact funding mechanism is defined. So with this, I conclude the summary of the main points of our response to the exploratory consultation of the Commission on future networks and its infrastructure in Europe. So I will now move to the next item, today's agenda, the presentation of our opinion on draft Gigabit recommendation, and I would like to pass the floor to Marco and Annegret for this second presentation.
Thank you, Kostas. Good afternoon to everybody. So on the 5th of May, BEREC released its opinion on the draft Gigabit recommendation. Next slide, please. And before going in highlighting the most important comments that BEREC did according to this proposal by the Commission, just a few words on the structure, on the layout of the opinion. The opinion mainly reflects and mirrors the structure of the draft recommendation by the Commission. For every section, there is an appropriate comment section, giving comments, but also providing amendments proposals in order to improve the final version of the recommendation according to BEREC. And before going to the main comments, a very short summary of the main issues, some general comments. The first is on the need of an appropriate transitional period before the full application of the recommendation, in order to allow NRAs to manage formally open proceedings according to the recommendation currently in force. And another general remark is related to the fact that of course, a recommendation aims at giving guidelines to NRAs, but the highly detailed and prescriptive provisions of the draft Gigabit recommendation, according to our view, runs the risk to unduly limit the discretion given to NRAs by the code, which should prevail. Now we can move to the next slide. I will focus on main critical points, of course. The opinion is quite long, and so today I will skip technical aspects and details, and of course all the points for which BEREC and the Commission are on the same side. So I will focus on main critical aspects according to BEREC. The first one is on the role of competition. BEREC appreciates the work by the Commission on promoting gigabit connectivity, which is one of the general objectives of the code. However, other objectives of the code, and namely promoting competition, should be equally considered in the recommendation. A couple of let's say a main example on this role of competition that we will cover also in other slides. We would like to remark that, for instance, in order to evaluate the possibility for relaxing or even deregulating markets, so abolishing regulatory obligation, it is always essential to verify the existence of competition safeguards, which is the very core business of every NRA analyzing markets according to market analysis. And this is something that in the draft recommendation we find sometimes a little bit more weak. Next slide, please. The second point, of course, which is related, is on the hierarchy between the code and the recommendation. BEREC would like to point out that the draft recommendation seems not always to be in line with the code, with the risk of overwriting the code and thus going behind. A couple of examples. The draft recommendation puts the existence of commercial agreements, commercial access agreements, on the same level as specific provisions that have been carefully negotiated by the user legislators, such as commitments under Article 76 or 79 of the Code, of the European Code, that have a specifically designed regulatory process before deciding to regulate on this basis. So the fact that commercial agreements and specific commitments more or less are in the same category in order to the regulatory outcomes is something for which BEREC is concerned. Another point seems to be only wording, but it's the message behind words. So it relates to the wording of Article 74 of the Code, which states that NRAs shall consider not imposing or maintaining obligations, whereas point 39 of the draft recommendation seems to limit the flexibility left to NRAs by saying the NRAs should not impose or maintain. Next slide, please. The third comment that we are highlighting today is on the role of asymmetrical SMP regulation, which is different from other obligation coming from other regulation in force. While SMP regulation is targeted on SMP operators in order to remove barriers to entry, and thus only imposes obligation on the dominant operator, other regulations such as the BCRD, which is quoted sometimes in the draft recommendation, are not designed to address the competition issues. Have several goals, such as reducing the cost for rolling out networks, and apply to all operators that controls civil engineers infrastructures, including, of course, SMP operator when applicable. So, in principle, BEREC thinks that access obligation to physical infrastructure resulting from the BCRD are likely not to be sufficient to address the competition problems identified in the market analysis carried out under the specific section of Article 64 and 67 of the Code. And all the statements related to BCRD may be, more properly better fit in the Gigabit Infrastructure Act by the Commission. Next slide, please. Comments related to the key role of NRAs in choosing remedies. So the first one is about the fact we would like to remark that NRA's flexibility in the choice of remedies should be consistent with the code and not narrow it down through the recommendation. And we already highlight the mismatching between Article 74 of the code and point 39 of the draft recommendation. But there is another issue on which BEREC aims at pointing out the attention, is that and relates to circumstances that justify the non-imposition of regulated wholesale access prices on VHCNs that cannot be, in our perspective, just emerging or prospective. Because potential competition alone, considering also the 5-year period of market analysis, potential competition alone doesn't lead automatically to a demonstrable retail price constraint. And according to these perception of this demonstrable retail price constraint, we fear that this could lead to withdrawing regulation also in case where it is needed, with all the negative consequences that comes out from this regulatory intervention by NRAs, according to the perspective by the draft recommendation. Next slide, please. Which is the final main points. related to adequate rewarding of the investment risks is a specific section of the draft recommendation. So mainly it is with WACC and the estimation of the VHCN risk premium, both arguments for which BEREC has a strong experience in the recent years. For the point related on how to deal with the temporary increase of inflation, of course, BEREC agrees with the fact that NRAs should be put in the situation to ensure that the WACC is reflecting current macroeconomic parameters, for instance, a high unexpected inflation rate, but within the dimension of an estimation of an efficient rate of return of the capital on capital employed, which means eliminating and remove all the provisions in the draft recommendation that are a sort of possibility to deviate by default by the WACC notice through sensitivity checks ex post or through application retrospective of the values of the WACC. We think that the WACC notice, even if issued before this period of high inflation, already provides NRAs with the flexibility to deviate from the methodology of the notice when duly justified, and there has been several cases already in Europe scrutinized by the European Commission. And the final point relates to the risk premium, for which BEREC thinks that according to the code, this add-on premium should be applied only to new investments in VHCN networks, so new projects, and strongly recommends an alignment between article of the code and points of the draft recommendation. So from my side, it's all. We decided to short very much the presentation, and now I give the floor to Willem and Alexander for the other point. The floor is yours. Thanks for the attention.
Thank you, Marco. Good afternoon also on behalf of the FNI Working Group. The title of the presentation is BEREC Analysis of the European Commission Legislative Proposal for a Gigabit Infrastructure Act. The European Commission published its legislative proposal for a Gigabit Infrastructure. Next slide, please. The European Commission published its legislative proposal for a Gigabit Infrastructure Act on 23rd of February. This proposal aims to facilitate and stimulate the rollout of very high capacity networks, so that such networks can be rolled out faster and at a lower cost. The Gigabit Infrastructure Act will repeal the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive of 2014. BEREC welcomes this initiative and regards it as an important building block to achieve the 2030 EU connectivity targets. BEREC hopes that it can be further improved based on the suggestions in the BEREC analysis. The main points of the BEREC analysis are as follows. Type of legal document. BEREC wants to point out that if certain provisions of the proposal are not removed in the final version of the Gigabit Infrastructure Act, it is important that the Gigabit Infrastructure Act is a directive and not a regulation. These provisions are those which in BEREC's view may result in an underutilization of the potential of a revised legislative instrument to promote the rollout of very high capacity networks, or may even have a negative impact on it. A directive will allow member states to adjust these provisions at national level according to the national circumstances. measures going beyond the Gigabit Infrastructure Act. BEREC considers it is necessary to ensure that member states have, without any doubt, the possibility to maintain or introduce such measures. BEREC believes that this is best ensured through the legal certainty of an article in a directive. For legal reasons, such an article doesn't seem to be possible in a regulation. Next slide, please. European Commission guidance. BEREC sees neither the need for further guidance by the European Commission on access to existing physical infrastructure, coordination of civil works, and access to in-building physical infrastructure, nor would BEREC consider such guidance advisable. The reason is that the most appropriate decision of the dispute settlement body will in many cases be highly specific to the member state and to the case in question, and very widely depending on circumstances. Scope. BEREC considers it important to reduce the costs not only of the deployment of very high capacity networks, but also of all state aid funded deployments of electronic communication networks to ensure that public funds are used as efficiently as possible. BEREC considers it also important to reduce the costs of the deployment of network elements which can contribute to the deployment of very high capacity networks, for example, fiber rollout in general. The reason is this also contributes to the achievement of the EU connectivity targets for 2030. Access to existing physical infrastructure. BEREC welcomes that the scope of access to existing physical infrastructure now also includes public sector bodies. BEREC agrees that with the conditions of refusal of access and the scope of physical infrastructure. However, the wording in the first part of the definition of the term physical infrastructure is not fully clear. BEREC also welcomes that the access obligation imposed under the European Electronic Communications Code and state aid rules prevail over the more general access provisions of the Gigabit Infrastructure Act. BEREC is concerned about the overly prescriptive provisions concerning the determination of prices as part of fair and reasonable terms and conditions, and suggests to remove the conditions laid out in Article 3, paragraph 2.c. Next slide, please. Coordination of civil works. BEREC agrees that an obligation to meet all reasonable requests for coordination of civil works should apply to fully or partially publicly financed civil works. BEREC welcomes that this now also explicitly applies to associated facilities. BEREC suggests to adapt the obligation in Article 5, paragraph 3 regarding the capacity of physical infrastructure in certain cases, as otherwise it could result in delays or even discourage investments. Access to in-building physical infrastructure. BEREC agrees that access to in-building physical infrastructure is important to reduce the cost of the deployment of electronic communication networks. BEREC considers that the Gigabit Infrastructure Act should make clear that member states have the possibility to maintain or introduce the obligation to provide access also to in-building cabling, in-building physical infrastructure and in-building wiring. BEREC welcomes in principle that new and majorly renovated buildings shall be equipped with fiber-ready physical infrastructure and in-building fiber wiring. BEREC suggests that the member states should have the possibility to decide on the national standards or technical specifications for the implementation of the fiber-ready physical infrastructure and in-building fiber wiring, and to remove the list of minimum requirements in Article 8, paragraph 4. Next slide, please. Transparency on the physical infrastructure and planned civil works. BEREC welcomes the revised transparency regime for information on existing physical infrastructure and planned civil works. BEREC suggests envisaging earmarked EU-level funding for single information points as the task of the single information points will increase. BEREC suggests that the proposed wording of Article 4, paragraphs 1 and 2 should be authoritative as both systems that store data decentrally and systems that store data centrally can fulfill the requirements, and therefore part of Recital 25 should be revised accordingly. BEREC considers the deadline of 12 months for making the minimum information concerning existing physical infrastructure available via the single information point to be too short. Dispute settlement. BEREC agrees with Article 12, paragraph 2 on the independence of the dispute settlement body and suggests to include also political independence according to Article 8 of the European Electronic Communications Code. BEREC is severely concerned regarding the reduction of the deadlines of the dispute settlement body to issue a binding decision to resolve a dispute from 2 to only 1 month. BEREC proposes to keep the deadlines of the 2014 Broadband Cost Reduction Directive. This ensures the high quality of the decisions of the dispute settlement bodies and avoids a possible increase of the number of appeals and also successful appeals, which both would result in a slower rather than a faster rollout of very high capacity networks. Next slide, please. BEREC welcomes that the dispute settlement bodies and the single information points shall have adequate technical, financial and human resources to carry out the task assigned to them. This is particularly important as the proposed Gigabit Infrastructure Act increases the scope of the task of the dispute settlement bodies and the single information points. Permit granting procedure. BEREC would like to stress that it is not possible and useful that a single information point analyzes all applications for permits and corresponding status information as foreseen in Article 7, paragraph 3. BEREC considers the information obligation under Article 7, paragraph 2 sufficient to support the submission of applications to permit granting authorities. BEREC therefore suggests to delete Article 7, paragraph 3, except the provisions regarding electronic format, and to replace it with an obligation of permit granting authorities to inform the applicants directly on the status of the application upon request. BEREC proposes not to include the following provisions in the final version of the Gigabit Infrastructure Act, as these provisions would likely have significant negative impacts and may result in a slower rather than a faster approval of rights of way. Mandatory tacit approval of rights of way, that applications for rights of way are deemed complete if deadlines are not met, and compensation in case of non-compliance with deadlines. Thank you. Now I hand over back to Kostas.
Thank you, Wilhelm, and also thanks to Marco for the presentation on the Gigabit recommendation. So now we will proceed with questions, the first Q&A part of today. As I mentioned in the beginning, we have already received questions before today's session by registered participants. So I will move to one of these questions by Ana Maria Rodriguez Bulgarin from TMZ Telecom, who asks about the final report on network usage fees. So let me take the opportunity of this question to discuss or to remind you what we have been doing on the topic of network or potential network usage fees and the fair contribution debate, and also our future plans. So in October 2022, we published our preliminary assessment paper on potential contribution from content application providers to internet service providers. And in the first part of today's session, I briefly presented our position in the consultation of the European Commission about future networks in Europe and the infrastructure and the connectivity infrastructure. So far we have, the last months, we have approved two position papers. Preliminary assessment in October 22, and our position in the Commission's exploratory consultation in May. For the future, in our work program 2023, some very relevant items are included. One is the report on IP interconnection ecosystem and market, which will be published for public consultation in plenary 2 of 2024, and we aim at approving it, the final version, in plenary for 2024. Another relevant thread of our work program is the report on the entry of content application providers in electronic communications networks and services markets and the implications brought by this entry. Again, this report will be published for public consultation in plenary 2 of 2024 and aiming for an approval in plenary 4 2024. Both these reports are relevant to the issue, to the topic of network usage fees, but at the same time they build on work that we have done previously. And let me remind you, one piece of such work was our Internet Ecosystem Report that has been approved in December 2022. So I think this summarizes what we have done so far, what are our future plans, and of course, as already discussed in the first part of today's meeting, but also clearly stated in our contribution to the Commission's exploratory consultation, we expect to receive the data gathered during the consultation by the Commission, and then we will analyze and see if we need to have something more on the topic based on the assessment of the data. I cannot see any other questions in the chat function, so maybe we can move to the second part of the debriefing. So I will first give the floor to our wireless network evolution working group co-chairs, Joe and Sitze, who will present the draft BEREC report on practices and challenges on the phasing out of the 2G and 3G networks, which has been adopted for public consultation. So, Sitze and Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kostas. And good afternoon all. I am Sitze van der Gaast, co-chair of the Wireless Network Evolution Working Group. And I prepared this presentation together with my fellow co-chair, Joe Lynch, who is also in this call. So the report on practices and challenges of the phasing out of 2G and 3G is open for consultation now, has been published today, I think, and will be open for consultation until August the 15th. Next slide, please. What was the goal of this report? That was to explore if and how the switch off of those technologies, the second and third generation mobile network technologies, the switch off of those technologies may have potential consequences with regard of the continuity of service for end users, but also with regard to wholesale access, coverage issues, impact on devices, especially Internet of Things and machine to machine, and also the possible impact on the emergency calls, so the interoperability and coverage issues that may be related to making emergency calls. Next slide, please. Well, a little bit of information about the process. We had a drafters group with participants from Belgium, France, Greece, Ireland, and the Netherlands, and input from outside of the drafters group and help from BEREC office. The work started in January and well, was completed today, but it's not completed yet because we are very curious about the reactions to what is now in the report, because we hope to improve it in the next stage. What we did is we identified and summarized previous work of other organizations, such as the RSPG, because we really did not want to repeat work of other organizations. And we conducted a survey to national regulatory authorities that are member of BEREC, to see what kind of experiences there are with the phasing out in the different countries. And we more specifically describe practices in a number of countries, France, Switzerland, Sweden, United Kingdom, and Hungary. We summarized the high-level impacts as we saw them in all the reactions. And what we also did is we tried to identify stakeholders and did a high-level analysis of stakeholder engagement, and all of this in a few months. So we are now here. We have already presented the draft report to the BEREC contact network group of NRA experts and processed the comments there, and also presented it at the BEREC plenary of last week, and so the publication was agreed. But as I said, we are not there yet. This is the basis, I hope, for reactions. Next slide, please. Well, in short, every goal behind the phase out of 2G and 3G also means one or more possible challenges. So by phasing out 2G and 3G, you want to achieve a more efficient use of spectrum by stopping the inefficient technology, inefficient radio layer technology. But, well, this may mean improvements, but there is a small chance that it also can lead to possible change of coverage. So you want to avoid that these are well, too disruptive and may impact service availability in rural areas or indoor. Well, by shutting down 2G and 3G, phasing out 2G and 3G is a better word. You want to achieve a better efficiency, reliability, security, and sustainability. And that is mainly achieved by decommissioning older equipment. But the challenge there is that some equipment may be difficult to replace. Well, an example is, of course, the smart electricity meters in household that may be replaced before their originally planned end of life. But also there may be still some older M2M equipment still in the field, and maybe some users are unaware. There is much work already being done to making users aware, but there may still be some challenges with that. And of course, you have the group of users that still use older phones, and especially the group of vulnerable users need attention, because when their phone doesn't, their older phone suddenly stops working, then they cannot make phone calls or SMS. Next slide, please. Of course, the phasing out of the older generations also means that you can focus on newer services with better quality, better choice, better flexibility. But then there are challenges with mandatory older services, like the e-call, the mandatory e-call that is installed in many cars, and some cars only can make 2G e-calls, so that is still a challenge. And also there are some backward compatibility issues on high impact services. So if the voice call or SMS in the newer versions does not work, normally you can fall back to older versions that do work, and therefore many customers or most customers don't even realize that they are not using the full potential of their new phone, but they are falling back to an older version of SMS or voice because there is some incompatibility issue between their phone and their visited network, for instance. But if 2G and 3G both are not available anymore, that could lead to the fact that voice calls are not always possible, and therefore also that emergency calls are not always possible. And even there are some messages that sometimes it's even possible that voice calls are possible, but emergency calls are not, and the other way around. But there is also some unclarity there. But it can also mean that SMSs cannot always be sent or received, and therefore that also leads that some authentication where SMS is being used is also problematic. Okay, another side of this interoperability issue, which mainly concerns voice over LTE and voice over new radio and also the newer SMS variants, is that not all MNOs and not all MVNOs are having the same ease of aligning the profiles needed to be aligned to make this thing work for all combinations of phones and networks. So, and that may create competition issues for, well, smaller MNOs and MVNOs. So these are the things we would like to look into, and where we talk about in the report, but we also would like to give to get your feedback on. Next slide, please. We think that this is a multi-stakeholder issue. Multi-stakeholder issue is maybe not the right word, but if these issues that I just described, if they really occur, then the way to solve it involves probably not only one stakeholder. Here is an overview of the stakeholders that likely are involved in the whole phase out, and well, maybe we do not even have them all, but then also we would like to hear what stakeholders we miss. A very short overview of practices that we saw and which are also important is a good engagement with stakeholders. We have seen that workshops have been organized with several combinations of stakeholders to get a better grip on the phase out challenges. The use of notice periods for every stakeholder to be able to make the relevant preparations. we have seen examples of campaigns to support affected users and to stimulate people to buy well, the equipment that will work in the new constellation. Of course, the RSPG report gives some relevant observations and recommendations. And what is important, and that's also mentioned, I mentioned that before, is the dissemination of information and guidelines to the public and the cooperation between the national regulatory authorities and the other competent authorities, as it is called, and that's, well, the other government bodies that are involved with the mobile market. Next slide, please. So the report is now published, and it comes with some consultation questions. So we hope to get information about what other potential challenges or impacts can be identified, and also how urgent people or organizations think these challenges or impact need to be addressed in time and priority. But also the other way around, what challenges and impacts have already been solved or can be considered minor. And for the remaining challenges or impacts, we would also like to know what organizations think, what stakeholders should initiate the efforts to meet these challenges, and also what stakeholders should be involved in efforts to meet the challenges or impacts, and of course, how should they contribute. So where applicable, we aim to use the input from the consultation reactions to further improve and finalize the report, and where possible reflect on possible solution options. So we really look forward to the consultation reactions, and we hope that a variety of stakeholders will react, market players, but also other public and private organizations. And we are curious about input that supports our observations, but also about input that disagrees with our observations, because, well, that's of course also very interesting. But we believe that if there are problems to be solved, then this can be only be solved by a combination of stakeholders. So stakeholder engagement is key here, and therefore I would like to finish with paraphrasing a famous person by stating, please don't only ask yourself how your organization can benefit from phasing out 2G and 3G, because the benefits are really clear, but also ask yourself how your organization can contribute to making this phase out, this transition, as smooth and as successful as possible. Thank you. This concludes the contribution of the Wireless Network Evolution Working Group, and I would like to pass the floor to Chiara and Margarita of the Digital Markets Working Group. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon from Digital Markets Working Group. I would like to present our work. Next slide, please. Well, just to set the scene, the use of number-independent interpersonal communication services, usually called NICs, has drastically increased over the past years and have now become a crucial means of communication for many different users across Europe. These services show economic characteristics such as proprietary network effects that give rise to lack of interoperability. In this context, in order to unleash and share such network effects among several providers and thus facilitate market contestability, interoperability obligations for specific NICs providers are included under Article 7 of the DMA and under Article 61, number 2 of the Electronic Communications Code, with a focus on ensuring end-to-end connectivity. The BEREC report on NICs shows that interoperability provisions under the DMA and the code work in a different yet complementary way. While Article 7 of the DMA will likely apply first, Article 61, number 2 of the Code may complement this regulatory intervention in cases where end-to-end connectivity are deemed to be endangered, or when the conditions or thresholds for imposing the measure are only met under the Code. Well, the BEREC report on NICS interoperability also focuses on the potential technical approaches and implementation challenges of interoperability measures, on the interplay between the Code and the DMA, and presents a list of minimum criteria for the reference offer. During the drafting of the report, a couple of workshops with experts on market entry in the context of the DMA and on cloud services were organized and really contributed to deepen the theme, and the drafters effectively tried to reflect it in the report. The draft report was open to public consultation from December 2022 until February 2023. Next slide, please. We received 10 answers, 2 from digital platforms providers, Google and Meta, 2 from stakeholders associations, ACTA and ETNO, 1 from a national consumer association, the Federation of German Consumer Organizations, and 1 organization like International Center for Law and Economics, 1 individual contributors, and 3 confidential contributors. Well, in general, the draft received a positive feedback and support, especially concerning the reference offer. We also received useful insights on details to improve the report, but no major changes were really introduced in the final report. Now I will pass the floor to Chiara, that is going to detail a bit more on the contributions received. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, and hi everybody. So together with the final report, we also publish as usual the report on the outcome of the public consultation, where you will find all the details about the contribution received and how BEREC treated these contributions. So I will now just highlight some of the main points of the contributions we received. In general, there was a general support for BEREC's involvement in the implementation of interoperability measures, and also the BEREC involvement in the DMA high-level group. There was one confidential contributor as well as Meta, who stressed the difficulties of interoperability implementations, especially concerning data protection and security. And they are also highlighting that they are not in favor of the definition of common standards. And of course, they give some reasons of it that you will find in the public consultation report. Google, on the contrary, highlights the relevance of defining common standards and considers the market for number-independent interpersonal communication services highly concentrated. A confidential contributor proposed the setup of certification body and a multi-stakeholders process for quicker decision on disputes and certifications, and also for the monitoring of compliance. ETNO and ECTA, they both support BEREC's analysis and also the criteria for the reference offer that we detail in the report. And ETNO was also highlighting the need for a future-proof approach concerning the regulatory treatment of number-based and number-independent ICS. The German Consumer Association supports a standard uniform encryption protocol to ensure the higher level of protection and data security and communication confidentiality. So this is just a selection of the main points that we received. And as I said, of course, there is a detailed treatment of all these comments later on in the report. On the next slide, please. Here we give an overview of the treatment. So on the support about the minimum criteria, there were some minor suggestions, but in general, it was largely supported. So we added some other addition to the list of criteria. And also what we thought was really important was to add some experience about some text about the experience of NRAs and BEREC with reference offers in the telecom sector. And especially what we wanted to share is the need for a structured regulatory dialogue that is a dialogue also with third parties who are concerned by interoperability measures and who can give a very important and very valuable information for the reference offer and for the definition and update of the reference offer. A second point was the need for clarification of the definitions, especially for NICs and business and end users. And on this, BEREC is referring to the definitions which are already in the law, in the NI-ICS and also in the DMA. Another point was concerning RCS, Rich Communication Services. And here we integrated some text, knowing that it is, of course, a very relevant point that we are also treating in other reports, not, for instance, a current report on large caps in ECS and ECNs. Then we also received some technical details to be added, especially this was coming both from the public consultation and from a workshop which was organized by the European Commission on interoperability measures in the context of the DMA, and to which BEREC contributed as well as a speaker. And there we shared our experience, and also the other speakers did the same, and we gathered some relevant information that, especially technical information that we wanted to add and integrate in our report. So this is the case for the final report. And then finally some details and clarification that of course were added, and sometimes with adaptations. On the next slide, please. So this concerns the future of work and future steps. So as most of you know, the DMA under recital 64 foresees the possibility for the European Commission to consult BEREC concerning the reference offer under Article 7, so the reference offer for the implementation of interoperability. And of course, BEREC is always at the disposal of the European Commission to further exchange on this point and share our technical experience on this. Moreover, BEREC is also a member of the DMA high-level group, so we will continue to provide expertise on any general matter for the implementation and the enforcement of the DMA. So this is all from our side, and I give the floor to Joanna and Elizabeth.
Thank you, Chiara. I am now honored to present you the monitoring of the joint statement agreement that was agreed between Ukraine and European operators. If you go to the next slide, please. This is the third type of monitoring exercise and the second report that BEREC is publishing on this aspect. However, the report this time and also the questionnaire that we drafted this time is slightly different compared to the one that was circulated last year, because this year we only addressed it to those operators that have signed the joint statement. Altogether, we reached feedback from 52 European mobile and 33 European fixed operators. And from the Ukraine side, we had 4 mobile operators and 3 Ukraine fixed operators that contributed to the survey. The survey covered information and data about termination, transit, and roaming rates, and also we had a few qualitative questions. If you go to the next slide, please. Starting with the results on termination rates, what we can see from the charts that are also published in the report is that fixed operators or fixed termination rates are higher than mobile termination rates. This might be because fixed operators only joined the joint statement early this year. And the termination rates are still much higher than the ones we have in the EU that are part of the European Delegated Act. If we go to the next slide, please. This is the data, the termination rates reported by Ukraine operators. What we can see here is that the joint statement had an effect on the prices, and joint statement signatories pay on average much less than those that have not signed the joint statement. If we go to the next slide, we have some analysis about wholesale roaming rates. Here we can see that on average, the rates are already very close to the wholesale caps that we have in the European Union. And when we look into the Ukrainian data, we can also see that this per gigabyte price that joint statement signatories pay are much lower than the ones that are charged between non-signatories. Finally, if we go to the next slide, this is about the transit rates. This time we also asked about transit rates. Here we can see from the results that again fixed operators are faced with higher transit charges, and on average European operators pay higher transit rates than Ukrainian operators. And overall we can say that transit rates are quite high and much higher than the termination rates themselves are. If we go to the final slide, it's about the qualitative questions, as the joint statements also includes that BEREC should deal with fraud and check whether there are fraud issues. We ask questions about if operators have fraud cases. Only a few mentioned that they have fraud. This is also the case because a lot of them have implemented preventive measures. The main fraud cases reported are SIM-box fraud, inflated SMS and calls, or roaming arbitrage. Furthermore, we also asked if there are any obstacles to implement the joint statement. Here, some operators mentioned that there is a lack of direct interconnection agreement, which leads to difficulties in lowering the rates. Furthermore, and this has been confirmed by the data I presented already, transit rates are also an issue to further lower the wholesale rates. What regards further improvements that operators are suggesting is to further increase the transparency, especially they mentioned to have in the bill separated the termination rates and transit rates, so to make it more transparent, and further align the termination rates with the euro rates were also proposals made by the operators. A few questions are about the retail measures that we ask operators. The results show that European operators still offer a number of retail measures, as they provide free SIM cards to refugees, free calls or SMS to Ukraine, but also other measures like they give free laptops, power banks or smartphones to Ukrainians coming to the EU. On the EU operator side, they report retail measures such as they pass on the low wholesale rates to the retail level so that the consumers and the refugees that are in Europe can have affordable or even free roaming when in Europe. This was it from my side, and I now pass over to Kostas.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and also many thanks to Zitze for the presentation on the 2G, 3G phase out, and to Margarita and Chiara for the presentations on NICS interoperability and the DMA. So now, before moving to the second Q&A part, I would like to give you some update on some of our activities. So first, I would like to give you some feedback about our recent BEREC study trip in South Korea. Took place the first week of April. We have already published a report describing the meetings we had there, and today I will very briefly present some key points. First, there was a lot of interest about 6G, which is expected to allow a fusion of physical and digital world with an increasing role of AI in the network. South Korea has already a strategy, a roadmap on the development of 6G, aiming at becoming a leader, world leader in 6G technology. With regards to AI, it is perceived as a change-making ingredient for all services. So a very important technology for other digital technologies and services. And on the interconnection, IP interconnection policy discussion, there are different views in South Korea. We had discussions with the government and regulators. We had discussions with other stakeholders. Different views have been expressed. Next slide, please. I would also like to inform you that we participated in the first DMA high-level group meeting that took place in May 12. During the meeting, we had the opportunity to share BEREC's views on the enforcement of DMA. And this is, this is the first step, I mean, with regards to DMA enforcement. During our last plenary meeting, we approved 2 reports about 2 recent workshops. The one workshop is on low Earth orbit satellites connectivity, secure and reliable connectivity, and the second one on the Data Act, and you can find this material on our website. We plan another very interesting workshop for next Tuesday. This workshop will cover the topic of the evolution of competition dynamics of tower and access infrastructure companies. Looking forward to this one. And also let me update you that during the last plenary meeting last week, we concluded the approval and signing procedure of the new working arrangements with the 6 Western Balkan regulators. This procedure was initiated after the European Court of Justice decision about Kosovo's NRA participation in BEREC. Next slide, please. As already presented by Zitze, the public consultation of the draft BEREC report on practices and challenges of the phasing out of 2G and 3G will be open until the 15th of August. Next slide, please. Let's proceed with the second Q&A part. And as I said, we have already received a few questions on the topics covered by the second part of the debriefing today, already offline by registered participants. So let me start by covering these questions. 2 of them concern the next steps of the DMA high-level group and the enforcement of the DMA. The high-level group will try to meet again during 2023, so there is going to be a second meeting this year to further discuss the application and enforcement of the DMA, taking into account the developments expected in the coming months. And most important, the designation of gatekeepers, which is currently in progress. The high-level group is preparing to provide the Commission with advice and expertise to ensure that the DMA and other sectoral regulations are implemented in a coherent and complementary manner. Moreover, as Margarita and Chiara already mentioned, BEREC remains available to assist the Commission in determining whether the reference offer prepared by the gatekeepers to ensure mixed interoperability allows to achieve the objectives of Article 4 of DMA regulation. So we have 2 questions on this next DMA issue. Another question we received is about providing more information regarding the workshop I have just mentioned on the evolution of the competition dynamics of the tower and access infrastructure companies not directly providing retail services and how to register in this one. The workshop is conducted in the context of an external study, in connection with an external study we ran this year, included in our work program. The main objectives of the workshop are to have an exploration of how and why infrastructure companies have been formed, their structure and access offers, and the implications for competition and investment in fixed and mobile very high capacity networks brought by these companies and this business model. The workshop will take place on Tuesday, 20th of June from 10 to 2:30. virtual attendance is encouraged by prior registration. In that line, there will be a notice on BEREC's webpage posted very soon. Now, let's move to questions in the chat. One question by Matteo Panizzardi. I can't see his organization. I cannot see his organization. It is unclear from the study visit report which stakeholders expressed favorable positions on the South Korean IP interconnection ecosystem regulation. Could you raise which South Korean stakeholders raise the benefits of the South Korean model? Well, as I said, we met government, we met regulators, we met internet associations and enterprises. From what we see today, government of South Korea continues this IP interconnection ecosystem regulation. It started in 2016. There have been amendments in this one. So this is the position of the government of South Korea. Of course, there are stakeholders not happy with this regulation, raising concerns. We have seen such kind of concerns during the debate in 22 and early 23. I would like to stay at this level of information, and yeah, what we can share is already included in our report on the study. Let me see the second question by Pinar Serdenjekti. Sorry if I cannot pronounce the name correctly. Again, I cannot see the organization here. Oh, from ECTA. Maybe, I'm not certain. The question is, could you provide us the information on the publication timing regarding the evaluation by BEREC of the WACC, weighted average cost of capital, parameters according to the Commission notice? This is crucial for operators in consideration of increasing WACC reviews performed by NRAs. Thank you. Well, on this, I would like to give the floor back to Marco for more details about the WACC.
Marco is not in the call anymore. Here's Annegret. I hope you can hear me. Yes, hello. I think the report was adopted for 2023 at the last plenary as an A item, and it should be published now on the BEREC website.
Okay, thank you, Annegret. Now I move to the next question by Luke Hendricks from ECTA. He says, thank you to BEREC for the debriefing and the good work on the recommendation. Will the next BEREC debriefing be done in person at the IRG office? We prefer and recommend in-person debriefings compared to online format, because this impedes interaction with the stakeholders. Yeah, indeed. Look, the next one is going to be physical in Brussels in October. I will come back to it also with the date. We also, I also prefer physical interaction and physical meetings, but as we also discussed during the stakeholders forum in March, it's not always feasible. Just to give an example, last week we have been traveling in BEREC plenary in Montenegro, and next week we have several meetings abroad, so it would be quite difficult for me to travel 3 weeks in a row, to be honest. Another question, Arthur, yes, I cannot see again the organization. Could you explain why telecom companies and CAPs both use South Korea in their narrative against and for network fees? Well, again, my own analysis, as I said before, during our study trip in South Korea, we had stakeholders being in favor of this regulation, some stakeholders being against this regulation. So it's natural that other stakeholders from other places interpret the South Korean example in the same way. Again, that is good or bad. But I think this question would be better suited to telecom companies and content application providers themselves to explain why, what they see as good in the South Korea example or what they see bad in the South Korea example. For this one, I don't see who is asking. Oliver Pag from Telefonica. Could BEREC say something on whether working arrangements have been established for the participation of the Moldovan Regulatory Authority in BEREC? If not, when is this expected to happen? They have not been established. We have established working arrangements with the 6 Western Balkan NRAs. Moldovan case will be considered in the future, maybe, but at this stage, we do not have any working arrangements with them. I don't see any other questions. If there are no other questions, I mean, we are already very close to the end. So before closing the public debriefing for today, saying goodbye, let me remind you that our next debriefing will be in October, as just mentioned, October the 11th, following BEREC Plenary 3 meeting, and this is going to be physical meeting in Brussels. So till then, thank you for attending today's debriefing and see you soon.